All right, well, let's begin our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, October 11th, 2022. We have a quorum, thanks to everybody who's here. First item on the agenda is the agenda. Any changes?
Not from staff.
No, we don't.
Then we have our agenda as presented to us. Item 2 is the public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to come and speak to us on pretty much any item you would like to. Do we have speakers for the public forum, Charles?
We do have quite a few folks. We're going to start tonight at the top of my list. So we'll start with Barbara Hedrick. Then we'll go to Sean Foley and then Sharon Busher. I'll put in the chat. If you would like to speak, please use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll put that in the chat. And we'll go again, Barbara, then Sean, and then Sharon.
Great. Hi, Barbara.
Hello, good evening, everybody. So it was very good that we went over to the Trinity campus and did a tour. And I would just like to share with you some surprises I had while over there and maybe some thoughts on how that might affect what we're planning on for the construction. First, I was over there earlier in the week on one of those canceled rain dates, and I looked at the dorms in the back of the campus. There are 5 buildings. They're small, they're short, they use a lot of land, and not very many people live there. And then I also noticed Farrell Hall, which is a house-sized building on a lot of land that only holds the Gun Institute of Environment's offices. And I thought those 2 pieces of land, plus many parking lots over there, really show a lot of land that's already been developed and isn't really being used in a smart way. And I'd like to see UVM build housing on those parcels rather than on the last open space that's available on that campus, which is along Colchester Avenue. So I was surprised that the last open space is being considered for development when there's other places that would be more environmentally responsible to build. Also, I was surprised that the green belt along there is so narrow, and I realized that the 20 feet that the city owns is going to have to be redesigned for a wider green belt so pedestrians don't get splashed by cars and trucks, and a wider sidewalk to accommodate more bicycle and pedestrian traffic. So that means that the graduate student building will actually be within 25 feet of the sidewalk, the new sidewalk. And maybe we should ask UVM to redo those drawings so we could see what that looks like, if you're going to allow them to build on open space, which I hope you don't. I hope that you ask them to look at these other places on campus and see if it would make sense to put the graduate students in some of those other poorly used, already developed sites on Trinity campus. Third, I was really surprised to hear Vice President Richard Cates say that the undergraduate dorm that they plan on building will be for freshmen. You know, that is problematic because it means UVM is only limited by the number of beds it has for freshmen, for how large its freshman class can be. So the more beds it builds for freshmen, the bigger its freshman class will be. And it wants as big as a freshman class as possible so it can maximize its revenues for the next 4 years. So every time we have UVM build more freshman beds, we're going to have a larger housing shortage when those people become juniors. And I just think it would be helpful to find out from UVM, what would it take for UVM to house all its juniors as well, for example, so that we can finally make a difference in our housing shortage in our town, rather than enabling them to make our housing shortage worse. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Barbara.
All right, next we're going to go to Sean Foley.
Hi, Sean.
Good evening. Thanks for having this. My name's Sean Foley. I live in Ward 5, and I have some concerns about the new zoning regs for the South End Innovation Zone. I've always been impressed by the views from Callahan Park, and so I'm concerned about the new height limit for buildings in the Innovation Zone being 85 feet. I know you're going to have somebody speak to this about the new regs down there, the new zoning regs later today in the meeting. I'm hoping that they might address what benefits are gained for going to 85 feet. I would like to note that a building at 85 feet in that area actually would be as high as Shelburne Road. And so everybody on the west side of Shelburne Road, that would be in the Birchcliff Parkway neighborhood and the Five Sisters neighborhood would, I know they're not going to put 85-foot buildings all the way across, but all those people would be affected. Their views of the Adirondacks would be impaired. And so I'm just concerned about it. So the two questions are, the one question is when they get to that point about discussing the zoning regs, what benefits are actually gained from going to 85 feet? And so what are they trying to do by going to 85 feet that can't be served at just at 45 feet? Thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys.
Thanks, Sean.
All right, next we're going to go to Sharon Busher.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, good evening. I wanted to speak to the commission and the department about the South End project briefly. I just wanted to applaud Charles. I think that's your baby. Excuse me. I have a respiratory issue going on, so forgive me with my gravelly voice, but I just felt that you have facilitated conversation. You've brought forward good questions. The commission has totally engaged. I was happy to hear a resident from that section of the city speak about some of his concerns regarding the proposed plan. I am not going to weigh in. I feel very strongly that the people that live in a section of Burlington should have the opportunity to give feedback and really have the most say in the approach that is taken and adopted. However, I value that section of Burlington so much, and I sent to Charles and Megan a statement, which is, it's not just germane here, but I am worried that we get the balance right between what we allow for housing because of the affordability factor and the need for housing, and the right to preserve that beautiful balance down there for commercial and entrepreneur development. And I just don't want to lose that. And I'm hoping that the residents down there see it the same way. I will respect them and their opinion, but I value that balance and what has been taking place there for now 10, 20 years. And it's just such a rich part of Burlington. So I applaud you for the process. I think the commission is fully engaged and wants to protect the existing neighborhood while allowing some potential growth and development. I now want to just step to Trinity campus, which is in a section of the city that I live in. And I'm hoping that the commission will afford that same concern for the surrounding neighborhood and understand, even though this property is owned by the university, the impacts still are the same if indeed they are out of sync with the surrounding neighborhood. It was interesting in the proposed zoning draft that you have, that there's a lot of language that talks about the state's flagship academic institution, and sort of I don't know, giving a bias to that institution, because that language is sort of refuting why it is atypical and doesn't respect the surrounding neighborhood. And as a member of the surrounding neighborhood, I take issue with that. I think that the institution is part of the city and part of the neighborhood, and should value their surroundings as much as we value them. I sent you a very lengthy communication regarding my concerns and the value, as Barbara Hedrick said, of the site visit. But what was missed was, because of the inclement weather, there were missed opportunities for the commissioners who did come, and thank you all who did, to see actually that back section where those 5 small dorm structures are that Barbara referenced, and the potential there, to really look at the parking area behind Delahanty, to look at the gun building, and to also hear, there were lots of side conversations, and Vice President Kate was responding to all of these various questions, and some of us heard some responses, but we all didn't hear everything because of the nature of when you're at a site visit and you're walking around, not everything's captured. But everyone took away that the housing that was going to be built, a lot of that housing would be for undergrads, which was fine, which is I support, but and in my first communication, it did reference the fact that if those classes keep growing at the end of the sophomore year, we are in a worse state than we are currently, because they're all going to bump out into the community. And I know some of this is beyond the Planning Commission's control. And but I know that the City Council hopefully will be able to address this somewhat with the University of Vermont, because we all live in this community that has limits. We have a lake. And so anyways, I just want to bring your attention to not only the communication I sent this past time, but the previous one, and ask that you think long and hard. And my ultimate request is to support the request for the buildings that are 110 or 150 feet setback and 80 feet high, but to postpone the action on the buildings that are closer, 45 feet from the sidewalk or the center line of Colchester Avenue, until we have a better understanding of where other potentials are before we utilize that last green space. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon.
All right, Andy, it looks like Sharon was the last speaker. Again, if you would like to speak, use the raise your hand icon. Give you a couple seconds. Bob Butani is going to be next to speak. Bob, I will unmute you.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, folks, and thanks very much for your time. I support using, as Sharon said, the 5 small buildings behind toward the back that could be potentially used for upperclassmen or medical students. And also getting back to the 2 speakers ago, the question by UVM's own admission, 71% approximately of juniors choose to live off campus. That puts a tremendous pressure on the housing market in Burlington, which has a 0.5% vacancy rate, I believe. I've tried multiple times every which way till Sunday to get a straight answer out of Richard Kate, but he just doesn't seem to, disclose what it is that UVM would plan to do to ease the housing crunch in Burlington. So that's all I have to say, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
All right, Andy, it looks like Bob was the last speaker.
Okay. Well, thank you to our speakers. And with that, I will close the public forum. Item 3 is the chair's report, and I don't have anything to report tonight. So we'll go on to item 4, which is the director's report. Megan?
All right, thank you, Andy. Since the last meeting, Charles and I and Sarah, who's also here from our team, have been busy working on the 2 amendments that will take up the majority of the time on your agenda tonight. So I'm going to be pretty brief because we have a lot to get through. But I did just want to call attention to an email that we had shared with the commission last week with invitations to a number of upcoming events to help provide some background and information about the work that we will soon be discussing on Missing Middle. So take a look at that and hopefully you'll be able to join us for one of those events. And then the only other thing I did want to mention is that next week, in the first half of the week, Charles and I will both be out of the office attending the Northern New England Planning Conference, which will be over in Maine. So we'll be out, but we'll be available if you have any questions or follow up later in the week when we're back.
Good, thank you. So we'll close the director's report and on to item 5, which is proposed CDO amendment ZA-23-01, South End Innovation District Overlay.
All right.
Charles.
Thank you, Andy. So like Megan said, we have a lot to get through tonight. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen here in just a moment. Once I get it up. So as you know, this is a proposed Southland Innovation District, which will be an overlay, in the Enterprise Light Manufacturing District. For those of you who are joining for the first time, there's additional information about the background of this on the city's website. So I encourage you to visit that website if you have any questions. But for the purpose of tonight, and because we have a lot to move forward, we're just going to begin the discussion with the 4 topics that we focused on last time. And hopefully we can discuss those and come to some resolutions, and then ultimately move through the entire amendment relatively quickly with hopes that you all would feel comfortable warning a public hearing for the November 15th meeting. So again, the 4 issues that we've been discussing the last couple of meetings actually have been hotels. The question has been whether or not to allow them at all, and if they should be allowed, what sort of limitations or restrictions should be placed on their development. The second issue is residential use and where residential uses should be located specifically. We've discussed whether or not they should be in new buildings only, and so we have a recommendation in the amendment that was in your agenda packet to bring forward. Regarding building height, thanks to the member of the, I think it was Sean, who spoke about that. We can answer your questions, Sean, and address those concerns. We have some graphics that I think could facilitate your discussion. And finally, blocks and new streets is the last issue. So again, the draft amendment, as it's included in your packet, does recommend that 1 hotel should be permitted per lot, and those are lots existing January 1st, 2023. And additionally, any individual hotel may not account for more than 80% of the gross floor area of the building in which it is located. Staff, after hearing the commission's discussion the last couple meetings and deliberating on this ourselves, we think this proposal strikes a good balance between the desire to allow hotels for the reasons that are listed here, economic development and recruitment for businesses and startups, Burlington's place as a remote work destination and recreation generally, as well as the sort of lack of hotel rooms in the city. Strike that balance with the concerns that we've heard from many corners that the South End is a very desirable area, and if allowed without limitations, they could proliferate. And so this is the recommendation. And so happy to have that discussion now, Andy, or we can answer any questions if you've got them.
Just at least some of the discussions now as you're going through. So anyone have any comments or questions on this? And I'll just say, in the absence of comments or questions, I think we'll assume that folks are okay with this. So I'd say particularly if you're not to weigh in. Julia?
I am okay with this. I think this is a great reflection of the discussions. I think, you know, I wonder with the 80% of the gross floor area, it would be ideal if the other 20% or more aligned with the intended uses of the district. But it may be outside of that. And I just want to note that as more of a comment than a question. But ideally, in my mind, it's something that would be artistic, residential, or innovation or office of some kind.
Anyone else? And I can't see everybody's picture in the screen. So if anyone else has a question or comment, you could just weigh in. All right. I think then, Charles, the takeaway is that overall folks are good with this.
Great, thank you. Okay, next issue is, again, residential uses and where they should be permitted. And this is something the commission has discussed at length as well. There have been good cases for allowing residential uses only in existing buildings. However, ultimately, staff recommends that residential uses should be permitted only in new buildings, existing as of January 1st, or within additions to existing buildings. So for example, if there's an existing building within the district, let's say on Pine Street, that is an artist use, and a developer would like to add some residential uses to that site, they could do so as an addition to that existing building, but they could not place those units in that existing building in that footprint. So this is the recommendation. Any questions or comments on this one?
Again, questions, comments, and in particular, if anybody disagrees with this. We've had a lot of discussion on this, so I think Charles is landing where, for the most part, I think where our discussions were. So anyone have concerns about this? Again, not hearing or seeing anybody. So I think you're on the right track again, Charles.
All right. All right, this is where we get to building heights. And you recall at our last discussions, we presented two different maps, just mainly to facilitate some discussion about potential approaches to regulating height. Recall that the model for our proposed height regulating tool has been the Form District Specific Height Area Map, which, if you're familiar or if you recall, is essentially regulates building height based on location within downtown or location upon specific streets. Obviously, within the Southland Innovation Districts, as it's proposed, we don't have that well-developed grid of streets, particularly in these larger sites. And so it's a little bit difficult to essentially, copy that approach completely. However, I think we have come up with a good compromise here, which is a specific height area map, as shown here on the right and in your agenda packet, that would allow buildings up to 8 stories, 85 feet, sort of in the core area of the district, along the edge of the Champlain Parkway as well. This is the recommendation. I'll move through. We did some analysis here just to sort of see, help you understand what those impacts might be. And again, remember that FAR should always be considered in discussions about building height. As Sean, member of the public, noted, it's not likely or even possible that one could develop 8 stories across the entire district, or even across those areas where 8 stories are permitted. So the floor area ratio proposal has actually been calibrated down to 2.25. However, with the 0.25 bonus for inclusionary zoning provision that ultimately means that any project in the Southland Innovation District that proposed residential uses would have a by right FAR of 2.5 because that inclusionary zoning would be required. And again, the inclusionary zoning rate is 15% in the district. So these are some shade studies. Note the date and times here. So the top two are from the summer solstice. And so these are going to be the extremes, right? So the sort of Southland Innovation District essentially runs north-south. So the sun is coming in from the east side, swooping down south, and then finishing the day on the west. And so that all that entails for shadows. And these graphics, notice that only the buildings in color are casting shadows. Every other building here would be casting shadows. And also please note the trees. Trees are obviously casting their own shadows and shades as well. And those are not, clearly depicted in these images. But top left, summer solstice, longest day of the year in the morning. As the sun is rising, you can see that the shade, actually, let me step back, note one other thing here. So as the specific height area map proposes, buildings would be permitted up to 45 feet within 100 feet of the western boundary of the district. Then it goes up to 65 feet or 6 stories toward the middle and along Champlain Parkway. In this image, one would be permitted up to 8 stories. Excuse me. And again, these graphics are really intended to show the impact to the Lakeside neighborhood. Lakeside is the only residential neighborhood to the west of the district, and to the east of the district, to a lesser degree up on Pine Street, there is some residential fabric, but for the most part, the surrounding uses are commercial, industrial. So at the end of the day, in the middle of the summer, as the sun's setting, the district would be casting some shadows on the lots to the east. The winter solstice, so early in the morning on the shortest day of the year, the shade impacts, are depicted here. But again, as the sun is moving through the day, most of those shadows are removed completely and mostly casting shadows on the district itself. At the end of the day in the winter, you can see the shadows are casting sort of toward Pine Street. We've included another set of analysis. So this is, if the district was built out today, October 11th, in the morning at 8 a.m., the homes in Lakeside closest to the rail corridor may be under some shadow from the district. But as you see by 9:20, most of that shading, if not all of it, is gone. And then by noon, essentially Lakeside is free and clear from shadows from the district. And by the end of the evening in October, you can see what the shadows might be. Again, obviously, there's many permutations for how this site could be developed out, and taller buildings may be located elsewhere, but we do propose that taller buildings would not, 6 stories, 8 stories would not be allowed right along the Lakeside neighborhood. We think this does strike that balance between the need to create more housing while respecting the existing residential fabric. So just to, let me see here. So this is also a section, and like Sean said, this is, it's a bit misleading, although I do want to show this section. So this building, the 2 buildings in purple depict what the height maximums would be allowed to be in the district. So this larger purple building is up to 85 feet. And if you draw a horizontal line straight up the hill, it essentially gets you to Shelburne Road. However, it's really important to note that there are trees all over the neighborhoods here, obstructing views as well. Really the only place where any view of the lake is possible from the Birchcliff neighborhood are on the east-west streets. And even then, it's very small slivers of the lake that are visible. Traditionally, it's not been the city's practice to, prioritize protecting views of the lake for upland neighborhoods. But then again, I think that the FAR, the building footprint, building floor plate maximums that we proposed in the standard try to balance that need for new homes, for new development, with the desire to sort of maintain some visual permeability as well as sort of actual physical connectivity through the site. This next image is going to look pretty dramatic. Again, so to the right, there's one sort of pink blob. And so if you're anywhere north of or east of Callahan Park and looking down the hill, you may see some taller buildings, you may not. As you go north, the max building heights along Pine Street there is 6 stories, set back 100 feet from Pine Street. And so essentially, the height impacts really go up a couple blocks to Caroline Street, parts of St. Paul Street. But again, it's not as if one would be able to build an 8-story building, a sheer wall, 8 stories along the Parkway or within the district. Again, the FAR and floor plate standards would preclude that from happening. But we do share these just for your benefit, for your, as you make this decision. So happy to answer any questions about building height. And we can get to Sean's specific questions as well if you'd like, Andy.
Yeah, Charles, could you, before we open up to the rest of the commission, could you address his question? I think that would be helpful.
Sure. So the primary question that Sean had was, why are buildings 85 feet proposed to be allowed? And 85 feet, 8 stories is shorter than buildings allowed in downtown. But I think the recommendation does acknowledge the tremendous need for new housing in the city, as well as the fact that some of the sites within the Southland Innovation District, being large, impermeable surface parking lots that are vacant at many times throughout the year, is not the best use for these properties, and that there's a burgeoning office market in the Southland Innovation District. This is a district that the community itself called for in Plan BTV South End. Of course, housing wasn't called for that, but as we all know, in subsequent years, the housing crisis has really come to the fore for folks in the South End as much as anybody else in the city, and people who would like to live in the South End as well. So 85 feet, again, is limited to certain areas within the district. I think Sean acknowledged this, but want to be really clear. So let me just go back up to the specific height area map. So 85 buildings up to 8 stories would be allowed up to 200 feet off of Champlain Parkway, south of Lakeside Avenue. And in that core of the 3 properties north of Lakeside Avenue, where the Innovation Center, Burlington Electric Department, and the Department of Public Works have their offices. Elsewhere, in blue are depicted those areas where 45 feet and 4 stories would be the maximum, and in yellow, buildings up to 6 stories would be permitted. Again, a bit more on this map. This is really intended to mitigate any shading, shadow, or view impacts from and to the Barge Canal neighborhoods just along Pine Street, as well as the Lakeside neighborhood. We do.
Charles, could I just add one quick comment on maybe less a benefit and more part of balancing this with other things we're trying to achieve, which are our benefits. Maybe if you could go to the next slide. I think to speak to Sean's question about what the benefit is, I think that in part, as Charles had mentioned, we have to think about height in conjunction with this standard, which is floor area ratio. And that's really a function of how much kind of space within buildings can be built on lots. We have, and really Charles has been studying the relationship of just how big these lots are to how much building could be built on them, and trying to understand, as we implement standards that try to limit kind of the span of building walls in order to create, a pedestrian friendly development environment. As we think about some of the standards that we talked at length about last time about having block perimeters and requiring that streets or pathways cut through these large parcels, it starts to limit how much of the sort of horizontal surface of a property can be developed. And so helping to reconfigure some of that with slightly taller buildings helps move what would otherwise be kind of developable area in a building just up instead of out. So we think that kind of combining this floor area ratio standard with the allowance for taller heights in some places helps kind of offset some of the other things we're trying to require of sites in this district.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, and I'll just add a couple more things. So the first is that throughout our community engagement, we did hear very strong support for buildings up to 8 stories. All of the public engagement summary is available on the website. And I would say that generally the most supported sort of height scenario was a mix of heights, a mix of 4, 6, and 8 stories. And so we think the specific height area map we proposed achieves that community objective. And the last thing I'll say is that 8 stories, there is an incentive built into the Southland Innovation District as it's proposed to incentivize mass timber buildings. Mass timber is a fairly new, at least in North America, construction type that is much lower in terms of its carbon emissions. It's embedded carbon. And so the incentive that we've built in that allows larger floor plates for the tallest floors, 7 and 8, in mass timber buildings, we hope will incentivize the use of this building and construction type that will help the city reach its net zero energy goals. So that's really the gist of why 8 stories are permitted. But ultimately, it's the community's vision for the district that really drove the height standard.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Questions, comments, concerns, if there are any from the commission?
Andy, I know you can't see everybody. I do have my hand up.
Go ahead.
So I would just want to be real clear on something, because some of these images can be very powerful without context. Was my first question. Then I also spent my run today not looking at the beautiful lake, but looking back at the site here, and also had some thoughts related to Sean's comment. But Charles, if you could go to this, starting with the shading study, I just want to make sure we understand this, and then maybe I would even just suggest we add a note on here. For example, on the first slide there, I believe it was the summer solstice. Yeah, the summer solstice. So just want to be absolutely clear here, Charles. This assumes basically everything surrounding the new buildings is completely flat. Is that correct? Because presumably and I may be getting this wrong, you wouldn't have the shadow from the building there on Lakeside Ave extending to Pine Street. It would be absorbed by one of the buildings there, existing buildings on Pine Street.
Sorry, I was muted. That's right, Michael. This is an imperfect depiction of the way shadows work.
Totally get it. I just think it's worth probably noting that on here in like big red letters, so that we're just properly disclosing what this depicts. Because, for example, you wouldn't have shadows extending to the lake either on the winter solstice. Not that anybody's going to be really in the lake in winter solstice, but that also is a consideration. So I just think it's worth noting that these shadows would be absorbed by other buildings. So I wanted to make that perfectly clear.
Buildings and trees, yes.
Which is similar to the view shed you created as well. Those, that would assume that there's literally nothing in the way up to those points. So those were just my comments. And so I think, in that context, all these are things I'm comfortable with as a commissioner. One thing I did look at going back to the view shed today was the Callahan master plan was just completed. The views from Callahan are noted as important. Those views, this is imperfect, obviously, but those views primarily align over the innovation building and the related tower. So obviously we've provided accommodation for buildings to go, on top of existing buildings. But that seems unlikely in the case of the Innovation Center, which was, built a long time ago and probably isn't structurally sufficient to allow vertical on top of it. So I would just note that is, that is some relief from the observations in terms of the impact on Callahan. The other thing that's in the weeds for the public to know, and I just wanted to call this out, and Charles, if I'm saying this wrong, let me know, is that, the floor, and I think you alluded to this, but the floor plate is limited to 1,500 square feet. So that could be 100 by say 150. And for comparison for the public, our blocks downtown are 400 feet. So, you have a number of factors there that will provide visual permeability and some mitigation of the impact on Callahan Park, which I do think is important because it was something that was raised in the recent plan. And then, ultimately, I think at some point you have to make some hard choices about where things go if you want to create some units for the benefit of the city.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Yes, I was curious about the massings chosen for this shade study and just what went into the mix of heights, what the variations are there.
Yeah, this is just, like I said, one of many possible permutations of this, but it does adhere to the building floor plate standard, except the blue building in the top left corner exceeds the 15,000 square foot, but I included it just for the, just for this. Everything else though adheres to the full the full set of tools and standards in the amendment. So four stories, 45 feet, just along the rail corridor to a depth of 100 feet. And then, from 100 to 200 feet off of the rail corridor, buildings of 6 stories are permitted. And so that's why you see the sort of height ramp up. And then across that sort of main corridor running through this site, you can see on the parkway, so buildings get 8 stories. We've heard from the property owners of 125 Lakeside that if they were to construct 8-story buildings, that they would likely be somewhere along the parkway or along sort of core of that site. So that's why this massing was chosen. But again, I think the massing does show that the goal of the district as it's written is to create a larger number of smaller footprint buildings to allow that permeability and visual connectivity to the lake and upland. And I think this reflects that.
And I think, like the caveats we mentioned about these shade studies and view corridor studies, we should, definitely make sure to say here that this is all just very conceptual from a staff perspective at this stage to help the commission understand if these are some of the largest sites within this district that have the most potential for redevelopment. And if they were to see some very high level of redevelopment, kind of what the layers of different standards could look like that you have been discussing. So just very conceptual to illustrate all those points.
Great,
Right.
thank you.
Anyone else? So I take it from what I'm hearing and what I'm not hearing as well, that generally the commission is supportive of the direction that this is taking us in, or sometimes more than generally. Okay.
And
Good.
Andy, I wanted to just add one point. Charles may have said it, but I might have missed it, that this map does kind of blend a couple of the options that you saw at the last meeting. We had lots of discussion about considering the relationship to the barge canal. And so Charles had modified this map to allow more staggering of the height from both east and west directions, and to also extend that consideration to development along the barge canal.
Yeah, and my own personal take on this is, I think it really does reflect the discussion that we've had over time. So, and addresses the concerns that we've had as a commission, and some of the concerns that we've heard also from the community. So, and I'm very comfortable with this. And again, I take it that the commission is as well.
All right, we
I
will.
want to add one. I am comfortable with this. I just, given that the justification for 85 feet and the response from the public was, you know, that height increase that height provision would be for residential. My only other note and question is whether, you know, that height limit can be reserved for buildings with residential. I don't know that it's even, you know, worth stating, because it's very unlikely that somebody would build an office building that large in Burlington, or any other structure that would meet the intents of the district. But that's just one thought I had there.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I will say that office floor plates tend to be much larger than the 15,000 or 10,000 for floors 7 and 8 that are proposed. And yeah, for that reason alone, it's unlikely that office buildings, market notwithstanding, would be built.
Good. Okay.
All right, we'll move along to the next topic, which was blocks and streets. So recall again that the lack of a block perimeter standard in the district would essentially not create the block granularity that is consistent with good urban design practice, or the going back to Plan BTV Southland, the community's desire to have a very walkable, bikeable, accessible district. And so the proposal is to allow, the proposal is, that previous slide had a bit of typo on it, a maximum block perimeter of 1,600 feet. Additionally, blocks could be enclosed by any combination of public streets and public paths. This is, again, just a depiction. This is not a map. It would not be going in the amendment, and this is not any suggestion that the city or anybody else is making regarding new streets. It's just to show that in these blocks depicted on the map on the right, those streets are in red and multi-use paths are in blue, which is just to say that these new blocks can be created by that combination of new streets and new paths. So you might imagine, you know, a block encircled on two sides by a public street with car access, and on the other two sides with multi-use paths. Both the public streets and public paths would have to meet DPW engineering standards. There is a process wherein developers and their designers can propose alternative streets that can be accepted by the city engineer, but that would be done through a sort of dialogue. But again, this is to create a granularity of blocks that mimics, at least dimensionally, what Burlington has downtown. This is not to say that streets should be, you know, rectilinear and orthogonal. They could be curvilinear or, you know, triangular. But We really want to provide some flexibility to developers, to owners, the city itself, while guaranteeing a high degree of connectivity, specifically for people on foot, for people on any number of wheeled non-car vehicle. So that's the proposal here. Any questions or comments on this one?
Any questions, comments? Don't see any. So again, I think you are on the right track and reflecting the discussions that we've had on our past several meetings on this item. So thank you, Charles.
All right.
Cool. Okay. Sorry, Charles.
Michael?
You're like, almost got through that. With the blocks, just looking at, I know this is like totally for an example, but is there, and maybe this is even like a question for Scott, is there some approval process for approving the blocks? And then the only thing I'm thinking about is just like again, this is just illustrative, but like the dead ends, like for like the car paths, for example. I don't know that I really have a complete thought on that, but just wanted to highlight that potential.
I can say briefly that we used to have road standards, and was the 1973 subdivision ordinance. That got chucked a long time ago, and the road standards with it. I think Public Works might have some basic standards, but they're not great. So in permit review, we'd rely pretty heavily on what's articulated in this overlay amendment as to configuration of the streets and blocks.
Yeah, I'm not
There's
really.
that, but there's also, sorry, I think Scott, maybe you could speak to this a little bit more. I think in Article 6 under our design standards, there's also just kind of like a general catch-all that says, you know, like streets in particular should make every effort to be connected into the city grid. You know, there are some other guiding factors, I think, for the review of that. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah, Article 6 has some standards as to connectivity. Yes.
Great.
So it's not to say there wouldn't ever be a situation like that, but I think between these standards and those, we could hopefully minimize that.
Yeah, I mean, if there's some compelling reason you want the flexibility to do that, but at the same time, you know, a lot of dead ends may not make a lot of sense. Just so it sounds like there's a provision that exists, and that's great. Just checking.
One other issue before I stop sharing this presentation, I spoke a bit with Eve's offline in this capacity, professional capacity, regarding floor plate size. I think maybe let me bring up, leave it on this image here. So in the amendment, as you recall, there's a 15,000 square foot building footprint standard maximum. The floor plate for 7 and 8, floors 7 and 8 is further reduced to 10,000 square feet. Something we've not discussed with you and that you've not raised in your discussions is office uses and whether that square footage limitation would be a hindrance to the development of office space in, let's say, fast-growing office markets where land is plentiful. Office floor plates tend to be around a minimum of 25,000 square feet with minimum dimensions based on the location of an office core. If you're familiar with office buildings, they're typically built with an elevator core, service core in the middle, and then going out from that, there's sort of a standard dimension that office users like to have, to the extent that they have one opinion. But those dimensions essentially lead to a building that might be something like 120 feet by 200 feet. It's our recommendation that if the commission feels compelled to increase the the allowable footprint for a building, that it should only be done for office uses. And there could be additional sort of restrictions or requirements regarding connectivity through buildings, that sort of thing. But we wanted to raise this. Perhaps if the others have any thoughts on this, I think you know, Eves, if you want to speak to your points that you raised earlier, I think it'd be great for the commission to hear them.
Sure. Thank you, Charles. And before I start, I have to say I've been quiet, but that's because I've been really listening and looking at what you've presented, and you guys have done an amazing job with this. I do want you to know that this is really good work, and I know it's been a heavy lift. So I just wanted to say thank you, and that's not to suck up, because that is not my style, but it's to recognize good work when I see it, and really listening to people and trying to come up with a fair design and fair principles. So I think you've nailed it. So thanks to both of you. Now, what I had said to Charles when he asked was that I was in favor of the larger footprint for a few reasons. You know, one is obviously when you're building an office building, you want to be as efficient as possible, and having the room to have that central core is essential, and it gobbles up a lot of room, because the way the regulations have been going, one elevator is typically no longer sufficient in a new building. 2 elevators are required, and one of those elevators has to be large enough to accommodate a gurney. So it's a big elevator. And so 15,000 square feet sounds like a lot, but between 2 stairwells, 2 elevators, mechanicals, et cetera, it starts to get gobbled up. And one of the things I think that we've heard tonight is that people are sensitive to height and height issues in this area. And by allowing for a greater footprint, I think that we can, the corollary is that we can put some limits on the height and say, we've allowed you to you know, grow horizontally, but the pain is going to be felt vertically. The other thing is that most office buildings are built to be multi-tenant buildings. Tenancies these days are typically smaller. That doesn't mean you can't have a whole floor for someone, but if you've got a larger footprint, it makes it far easier to create corridors that allow for good-sized offices around the perimeter. And so it's a more efficient design. And finally, the comment that I made was that, you know, what we've seen, and some of you may not be aware of it, but some of you may be, but buildings that have been built recently, office buildings, in an effort to try to gain as much square footage as possible because of the height restrictions and frankly, the footprint restrictions with small lots, they've tried to, you know, take a building that realistically should be a 5-story building and made it into a 6-story building. And what that means is you walk into a lobby, and, you know, if you imagine a lobby in an office building, you know, in sort of normal circumstances, there's a sense of arrival. You know, you've got high ceilings, you've got, you know, something that makes you feel as though you're not just walking in the back door. And I would love to see the ground floor in new office buildings have more height, because I think it just creates a much better environment. And if we are going to be looking at doing potentially mixed use, not residential, but potentially retail on the ground floor of office buildings, having those high ceilings really does help to create that sense of difference between the ground floor and the upper floors, and to create storefronts or business fronts that are really pleasant and interactive within the community. So those are the few things that I suggested to Charles.
So Yves, if I could ask, or Charles, if you want to say just what difference would that be then from what you've proposed?
So
or what's proposed right now?
Our proposal would be to allow buildings with an office use to have a footprint of 24,000 square feet. So floor plates of office uses could be up to 24. But in residential buildings, in mixed use buildings that are just retail and residential, for example, the floor plate would stay as it's in the amendment at 15,000 square feet for a footprint. And the floors 7 and 8 floor plate would still be restricted to 10,000 square feet. So it's really just increasing the max footprint for office buildings up to 24,000.
And what would happen if it's a mixed use where there's some office, some residential, whatever?
Yeah, it's my recommendation that the increased footprint would only be permitted in buildings that are office only or office plus retail or community space, and that buildings with residential uses should always be limited to 15,000.
I'll just start off by Eves, unless you have something else to add.
I'm all set, Andy. Thanks for asking.
I mean, I'm pretty supportive of what Eves is talking about. I think it makes a lot of sense. The only piece I might add is if we're moving in a direction like this, I wouldn't want to discourage a mixed use of like some office and some residential. And I'm not sure if doing it the way you just described it, Charles, would discourage the mixed use, that people might have to choose one or the other. But so I'm not sure about that, or how that might work. But generally, I'm supportive of this concept of what's being talked about. And where are others on this? Anyone have
Andy, I don't know.
disagree with it?
And if you don't know if you can
Michael?
see my hand, yeah, thanks. So I think in general, I'm glad you brought this up. I think one of the things we have to balance is the fact that we have an acute housing need in the city, but this is also something that will be here in perpetuity. So we have to think through both the acute housing need as well as what is going to be best for the health of the city in the long run. That said, office is, who knows in many ways. And I think that it's impossible to sort of predict the future, given it's in such a variable time. What we do know is that there is some office space here that does well, and people like it because it's older space and it's unique. And I think that the problem with this proposal is that it would dramatically change the assumptions that have been relied upon to create the block sizes, that gave commissioners comfort that there would be permeability between the buildings, even despite the fact that we have larger block sizes, as well as the visual permeability that we just spoke of with regard to the view shed. So I think it's probably unlikely this would ever be needed, but I think if we were to adopt this, it calls into question a lot of the assumptions we've made. And Charles has really been threading the needle on a lot of unknowns as he develops this whole proposal. So I guess I'm against this, but I think sympathetic to the consideration.
Others?
Andy, just in the interest of time, because we would like to get to the UVM Trinity amendment as well. We can bring answers to these questions to hopefully the public hearing if you warn the public hearing and propose a solution at that time.
Okay, what would folks like to do? We could move forward to a public hearing with what we have now. And if there are changes we want to make, we can make it then. Or we could have further discussion on all of this. And if we're going to a public hearing, we would need a motion to do that.
I would make the motion to move this to public hearing just to get that on the floor.
I'd second that. And I think, I'd like more time to think about this specific proposal, and I think it would be great to have that as a part of the public hearing.
Okay. Any more discussion on that? All right, well, we have a motion to warn for public hearing. All right, again, we have a motion for public hearing. Any comments before we go to the vote? All right, All those in favor of the motion to go to public hearing, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. So we'll have this warned for public hearing. Charles, Megan, thanks for all the work that you've done so far on this. I think it's been a great job, and look forward to the discussion we'll have at the public hearing as well and follow
Great.
up to that.
Thanks, everybody, for your input. That was great.
And with that, we will close item 5 and move on to item 6, proposed CDO amendment ZA-22-04 UVM Trinity campus zoning.
All right, I will take this one, Andy. And I thought because it's been a bit of time since we first talked, or since we last talked about this, that I would just quickly recap for the commission what the proposed changes are to the existing Trinity zoning. So let me just pull up a slide really quick.
Megan, before you get started with that, could I just ask who is here from UVM? I assume some folks are.
Yes, we have Lisa Kingsbury and John Collins who are here from UVM. So if you would like, we can promote them to panelists if it would be helpful for them to help answer questions as well.
Sure, why don't you do that?
Okay. Charles, could you switch them over while I'm just running through this?
Yeah, Lisa and John, you should be panelists now, and you are.
All right, great. So as we've discussed a number of times in your past meetings, there were several requested changes to the existing zoning for just the Trinity campus overlay that's within the institutional campus district. So this chart here summarizes what those changes are. And I'm not sure what screen you're seeing right now. Are you seeing a full slide, or are you seeing my PowerPoint?
We're not
seeing your
the
PowerPoint but it's the main PowerPoint screen. So we can see your slide and the left-hand panel.
Okay, great. It doesn't seem to be working for me right now, so I will just go with this. So this is
now we can't see anything.
Okay. You would think that after all this time, I would have this down. Give me 1 second here. How about now?
Yes.
Looks good.
Okay, you're seeing the PowerPoint. Great. All right, so this is the summary of the proposed changes. As we have discussed in our previous meetings, the first several of these requests came from UVM in an effort to help facilitate their interest in infill development on the campus. So the first 3 of these proposed changes to building height, setback, and lot coverage are requests that you received from UVM specifically. In our discussion about this amendment, we also discussed 4 other standards that are within the Trinity campus overlay that we felt could help facilitate the sort of vision for redevelopment on that campus. So the text that I sent to you and that was posted online yesterday provides a full markup to the zoning ordinance to implement these changes. The first couple of changes are specific to where the setbacks are on the property and what height would be allowed within each of those setbacks. So this is an image that you've seen before. And I think in our previous discussions of this highlighted for us that when we talk about setbacks, the property at Trinity campus is somewhat confusing in that the property line is set back further from the street than many properties we're used to. So there was a discussion about better articulating these setback standards from some fixed point in the city. And so we have updated this map to largely retain the same proposed setbacks that we've talked about in our previous meetings, but to express them as setbacks from the center line of Colchester Avenue instead of from the property line. So the first set of changes is to really address the setbacks. So the first change would allow for development in front of the existing setback, which is about 155 feet from the center line of Colchester Avenue. Today, no buildings are allowed there unless they are very small, I think less than 200 square foot structures, and no new parking is allowed within that setback. This proposes now to allow buildings in front of that setback line. So here we're talking about the red setback that says 155 feet. This would allow buildings in front of that, but no closer to the street than this blue line, which is 65 feet from the center line of Colchester Avenue. So that's the first change with regard to the setbacks. The second change, and it's very much related to those lines that I just showed you, is the proposal for allowing additional building height. Today, the building height is limited on the Trinity campus to either 35 feet or the tallest of the existing structures, which is about 55 feet. This would allow buildings up to 45 feet in between those two setback lines that I just showed, and 80 feet beyond the setback line. So when we're talking about these setback lines, again, this would allow buildings of 45 feet between the blue and red line and 80 feet beyond the red line, further to the north and west in this area. And we've also previously looked at this section that UVM had provided to us to look at this in just a different way. So again, and I should have made these blue and red, I apologize, but this would allow buildings up to 45 feet between this orange and purple line, and then buildings of 80 feet beyond that purple line. So I think it's just important to underscore again that while these numbers are different, 65 and 155 feet, they are the same standards that we had been talking about in some of our earlier meetings. We've just changed where we measure them from. And then the final requested change that came from UVM was to allow for an increase in lot coverage on the Trinity campus from 40 to 60%. We've also had some discussions about addressing other standards, such as the applicability of density standards on this campus. In order to help us facilitate our shared goals of seeing more housing on the institution's campuses, this amendment removes the density limit for dorms and housing that's built for the exclusive use of students. So that makes this this overlay more consistent with other parts of the campus where density limits are not applicable. In terms of parking, there is currently a prohibition on new surface parking lots on the Trinity campus. This maintains that standard, but goes a little bit beyond it by saying that if new parking is to be part of a project on this campus, we would like to see that built in garages and facilities to help maximize and make more efficient use of parking resources. So while there have been some questions about UVM's immediate plans for building structured parking, this simply facilitates the allowance for them if they were ever to be desired. We also discussed that today, a number of the commercial uses that were allowed in the Trinity campus overlay were really limited to existing buildings and were required to go through the conditional use process if they were included in new buildings. This allows those commercial uses in any of the buildings on campus, new or existing. We also made a few minor tweaks based on some of our earlier discussions to the use table and have removed some residential types like single family and duplex from the allowable uses in this district and added just a couple of commercial uses that are in the same vein as the commercial uses that had previously been allowed, in order to help us kind of calibrate what our goals are again for the Trinity campus as a kind of mixed use campus environment. And then we also talked about the fact that there has been a lower threshold for projects on this campus to be required to be reviewed under the major impact standards. So the changes that you see in the document make this district more consistent with the underlying zoning district. So a higher threshold for when major impact would be required. One last element that we had raised with you, but had not yet finalized in our last discussion was this question about, some kind of connection of campus developments to the broader campus plan, and how to better connect, especially as we think about removing that lower major impact threshold, how we connect individual projects to the bigger picture of what we are anticipating happening on this part of campus. So the text that you received with the amendment language has a new section at the end that would be applicable to this Trinity campus overlay zone, introducing a new requirement for applications. So this new requirement includes specific standards for materials that have to be submitted with an application for Trinity campus, including the submission of a conceptual plan or a portion of an institution's land bank map, as we saw in some of our presentations from UVM, that helps us link future areas planned for growth on the campus, connects the dots with information that's provided in the Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan about future buildings, and kind of synthesizes them all together as part of an application for individual development on this campus. It also includes standards for articulating kind of how the proposed development relates to future forecasts for enrollment and space needs, essentially. So it helps us better understand how individual developments relate to the institution's anticipated future user groups. And I think importantly, kind of in the big picture, it also introduces a reporting requirement that may or may not be combined with the Joint Institutional Parking Plan requirements that just help us better anticipate and plan for potential future projects or impacts that the city needs to be cognizant of. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and happy to walk through the language with all of you if that would be helpful, since this is new. Some of this is new to you since the last time we talked about it. But I think one of the other important elements that I just wanted to speak to is that through the public meetings and through the public forum that you have heard as we've been discussing this change, we've heard lots of questions and requests for something that is more authoritative in terms of requiring things of the institutions in terms of who they're housing and how, or even requiring certain information be provided. The introduction of this last element that I just mentioned is an attempt to be responsive to some of those concerns within the limits of what is legal. And specifically, as you look into the language of the ordinance that we provided to you, there is a statement in here about, the applicability of our institutional campus zoning overlays in general, as it applies to the regulation of UVM or any other institution. That there are certain, limitations on local zoning that state statute grants certain institutions. The city is one of them. The colleges are another. The school district is another. That really kind of targets what we are regulating from a zoning perspective, and is intended to make sure that we are seeing development that's consistent with our community's vision, but in a way that does not interfere with the intended use of those really fundamental community institutions. So all this is to say that we've tried to really thread the needle in terms of providing additional context and information for individual development projects within the Trinity campus district, within the limits of that area of state statute. So I'll stop there, and I think happy to take any questions or walk through the language if you'd like to do that, Andy.
I think it will be helpful to walk through the language. I know at the beginning during the public forum, there are a few questions that were asked. the um, the dorms on the back part of the campus, if those were going to be, if the redevelopment could happen there, and also just the impact that this would have if it is going to be used for freshmen, the impact it would have, like whether it increases the number of students at UVM and ultimately then feeds into the community, like when they're juniors or seniors, into, you know, housing outside of UVM, and whether we have what if anything we can look into on that.
Great. So I think probably to answer those two questions, I'll look to Lisa, actually. I think that those are really geared at the university's plans for what could be built here, more so than what the zoning would allow.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. So in terms of the back five, you know, I don't disagree that that's an area that maybe is a little bit underutilized right now. They are buildings that we looked at a number of years ago in terms of renovating them. And I don't have numbers with me around that today, but my understanding is to really bring them up to code and to a better standard would be quite expensive. To take them down would mean we would be without 200, there's a little over 200 beds there now. So, you know, if we were to do that before we added new housing somewhere else, we would be, you know, without 200 beds for a couple of years, for the time that it would take to get through, you know, demolition and construction of a new project, which is why we decided to focus on another area and starting there in terms of new development on the campus. The questions around enrollment. So, you know, we've talked about it being freshmen and maybe sophomores in these dorms as well. And I think that's a thinking just around, you know, who might be the most interested in living on Trinity campus. I was just reading Sharon Busher's submission, and I just want to, Sharon, I'm sorry you're not feeling well if you're still here. I just want to make a note, just a correction of what Richard Kate had said at the meeting in terms of freeing up some capacity. In the letter, she talks about Redstone Lofts. Redstone Lofts and Redstone Commons are privately owned projects that we have on our campus that do house juniors and seniors now. So there's about a little over 600 beds for juniors and seniors between those two projects. What Richard Kate was talking about at the site visit was about the housing within the greater residential life buildings, not Redstone Lofts, Redstone Apartments. And what he meant was, as we, you know, would be able to build these additional undergraduate beds, if freshmen and sophomores were concentrated there, that could free up some space in the other dorms to allow for more juniors and seniors and additional capacity there in the residence halls. You know, in terms of future plans, I think we've talked a bit about, you know, our enrollment has gone up the last few years, and I understand that that's a concern for the community. We don't know that that's something that's going to be sustained. I think we've talked before, and a lot of people know about the challenges with some of the demographics with high school age students, particularly in the Northeast. Those numbers are going down. We seem to have bucked that trend a little bit, maybe because of the impact of COVID and Vermont and UVM being seen as a very safe place to be during and following the pandemic. But, you know, my understanding is we don't have plans to grow that undergraduate, to continue to grow that undergraduate enrollment. And I think that this new language that's been added to the end of the draft ordinance does give the city, you know, some longer term assurance that we will be able to share our numbers and our 5-year projections on a more regular basis with the city, so that you can see, you know, annually where we think we're headed.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Before Megan goes through like the draft code, are there any questions or comments for either Megan or for Lisa? Okay, Megan, why don't you walk us through?
Okay, and hopefully my screen share will be much more straightforward this time. All right, are you seeing language here? Screen?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. So one just quick note for you, you'll start to see the draft ordinances come in a slightly different document format than you're used to. We are plugging them into our ordinance template that the city council usually sees after your work in an effort to just be more efficient at a staff level. So there's a lot more boilerplate on here than what we normally look at as a commission, but it's all helpful in streamlining the zoning process. So the first thing that you see on what's starts on page 4 of the document that was sent to you yesterday is an excerpt of the ordinance that relates to our institutional core campus overlay districts. This outlines all of the districts that we have, and the new language that's introduced here at the very beginning is a discussion about how development on these campuses may be further limited under the considerations of the state statute that I was just talking about. So it's just an acknowledgement here that if and when there are conflicts, we need to make sure that we are complying with the state law. The next section that you see here, moving into page 2, that starts with number 3. This is a description of the Trinity campus overlay specifically, and the intent behind it. This has been expanded slightly now that we are clarifying the purpose of this to grow as a portion of the institution's campus, as has been in our plans for some time. As we move down the page, we start to see some changes to the text that introduce the kind of dimensional changes that were requested. So right here on line 51, we see the change from 40 to 60% lot coverage. And the rest of this sentence is just updating a reference to our inclusionary ordinance. It was out of date. The next section, as we move into the top of page 3, establishes those changes to setbacks that I had shared earlier. So this replaces the blanket, what used to be the 115-foot setback from the front property line of the Trinity campus, with the 2-tiered setback that we talked about. First at 65 feet from the center line, where first at 65 feet and then between 65 feet and 155 feet. We have also inserted the map that updates and replaces the existing setback map that was in the ordinance. So you'll find that on page 4. The provision here towards the bottom of page 4 that strikes all of the language about surface parking is not an intent to remove this. It's just being moved elsewhere within this ordinance. So I'll point that out when we get there. And then the last piece here on page 4 is also the establishment of that 2-tiered height limit. So the 45 feet between the 65 and 155 foot setbacks, and then 80 feet beyond the 155 foot setback. On page 5, the discussion here about density implements the discussion about exempting dorms or residential units that are specifically for students from the density limits in this overlay. They would otherwise be limited to 20 dwelling units per acre. The bottom of page 5 updates our policy about uses on this campus. And as I noted before, it removes small residential uses such as single family and duplex uses from being allowable within this overlay. It also makes some changes to individual uses that are in our use table. So a number of these have actually been stricken because they are not uses in our use table anymore. So there's some changes here to make that consistent. And I think as far as new commercial uses that we are proposing to allow within this district, we've added only beauty and barber shops, parking garages, and laundromats, because they felt very consistent with the sort of neighborhood scale retail and commercial uses that we've talked about. Here on page 6, you'll see that we've also removed that language that says that these uses are conditional if they're in new buildings. Here's where we've moved that parking language. So this acknowledges that in this overlay district, parking uses are planned for under the JIP, but then also specifically notes that new surface parking lots should not be added unless it corresponds with the removal of surface parking spaces. So we've retained that element. And then the final piece here, the remainder of the document, is this new application requirement that I had shared. So you can see here, we replaced the existing standard that requires major impact review at a lower threshold with this application materials that are to be submitted. I think one thing to just be clear about is that at this time, given ownership, we are fully anticipating that the development that we would see on this campus is associated with UVM, but we also acknowledge that if there were ever to be development happening within this overlay that wasn't associated with UVM, we would want all the sort of other areas of our ordinance to continue to be applicable. So we mentioned here specifically in asking for this additional material as part of an application that what we're really interested in is information from the institutions themselves. So that's the first part, requires this of institutional developers. This then also notes, again, kind of similar to the language up at the beginning of the document, that this information is being provided for informational purposes to the city, to help us with our planning and to help us with contextualizing development projects, but is not meant to be provided as a way to introduce a new development review standard that could require a project to be conditioned or even denied in any way that's inconsistent with our ordinance or with the state law. And then beyond this, it talks about what needs to be submitted. So this outlines 4 points that need to be included in an application. The first is the plan, as I had mentioned. It could be a conceptual plan or a land bank that helps us understand how the density and location of a project relates to what's been planned for the campus. The next piece is an explanation of the extent to which the application may modify something that was in the joint institutional parking management plan. That would be required, but we're reiterating that here. And then the last 2 are really about kind of how this relates to future projections. So number 3 is for residential developments. The institution shall provide the number of dwelling units and how it relates to forecasted enrollment in all of their academic programs, and particularly for students who are required to live on campus and students who would not be required to live on campus. And then point 4 is for non-residential development, that information would be provided about how the project relates to forecasted growth in classroom, office space, all the non-residential space on the campus. The final piece then here on page 8 is the annual reporting requirement. So this requires that for the same 5-year period that they are providing information on future forecasts, that they provide a report to the administrative officer, which is Scott and his team, about how the implementation of this development is going related to those pieces of information that we request above, and does allow this reporting to be combined with their annual reporting on their joint institutional parking plan, as long as all the details are provided as outlined. So that is all that we have in the language, Andy. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Oh, Andy, you're on mute.
Just realized that. Thank you, Megan. Comments, questions from the commission? All right. Michael, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, Megan, can you walk me through on the institutional parking management plan that's submitted, that gets approved by, I guess, the DRB, and then that is needed to actually get a building permit or the, I guess, zoning approval? Maybe I have that right. How would this new, just having the transparency on campus beds versus off is super helpful and brings attention to the issue, but how would that sort of play out from an approval process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is not a new review standard. So this does not have the same level of applicability as the joint institutional parking management plan. These data that are requested or required as part of an application are intended to be informational and provide context, but do not carry the same kind of weight as an approved parking management plan that actually gets reviewed and approved by the DRB.
Any other questions? What would the commission like to do? We could continue discussion. Julia?
Yeah, I do have just one question about the set of criteria at the end that would be associated with any application. I'm wondering for the question where they're required to characterize how the development would interact with enrollment projections, if there can also be a question there about how the proposed expansion development would exacerbate or alleviate pressures on housing for the city. If that's something possible to add there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and that was something that we had really done some vetting around, is that question. Ultimately, in our legal review of our authority to regulate institutions, it became very clear that it was really outside of our scope to ask for them to comment on how or to create a new review standard, I guess, that would look at that off-campus condition as you're requesting.
Anything else? So what would the commission like to do at this point? We could continue our discussions, continue on another day. We could warn this for a public hearing. It looks like the language is all set for that. What would the pleasure be of the commission?
I'll make a motion to warn it for public hearing.
Okay. Motion for to warn this for public hearing. Is there a second? Seconded by Bruce. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Any opposed? So this will be warned for a public hearing, and then following the public hearing, obviously, we'll continue our discussion on it.
Right. Great.
Good. Thank you, Megan.
Yves, I think you're not on mute.
Thank you, Megan.
You're welcome.
Good. So with
that was
that,
an I vote or something. I don't know.
we'll close item 6, move on to item 7, which is commissioner items. And when is our next meeting again? It's in 2 weeks.
October 25th.
Okay.
And then recall, we've got just the one November meeting, the 15th.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah, sorry
But
about that.
there
We
is-
didn't catch that it said September in the agenda.
Yes.
Sorry.
But there is a housing trivia night on November 3rd, which I was very excited to see. I'm already scheming on a potential partner, so.
All right, great. That's what we like to hear. Sarah is working very hard on helping us organize walking tours and trivia nights and all sorts of fun educational opportunities about housing. So
Good. And Julia, you had your hand raised?
Yes, I just wanted to share, I won't be at the Northern New England Planning Conference next week, unfortunately, but I was able to attend the Colorado American Planning Association conference in Vail 2 weeks ago, and that was a great experience. My first time attending a conference like that for the American Planning Association. And what I wanted to share that's relevant to this commission is a lot of other communities, definitely not just in Colorado as well, are reviewing projects that are very similar to the Southland Innovation District. I attended a couple sessions that were related to the concepts that we've been talking about for that district, including one on makerhoods, which I guess we could call that district a makerhood, basically a neighborhood that also is trying to preserve artistic uses. I think this project is distinct from a lot of the ones that we were looking at there because this is really focused on remediating sites that, or, you know, a lot of it is taken up by surface parking. And then a lot of other communities are trying to revitalize a lot of existing buildings. But I just wanted to share that other communities are looking at the same things and also facing the same issues related to affordable housing, as we all know. And yeah, I'm looking forward to reporting back from future conferences that I attend related to planning.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? All right, we'll close that item, move on to item 8, which are minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications? Motion by Julia. Is there a second? Seconded by Michael. All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, that passes. And adjournment is next. Motion to adjourn by, who would like to make that motion? By Julia, seconded. I saw your hand go up, Michael, seconded by Michael. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye or raise your hand. Great, and we stand adjourned. Good meeting. We got a lot done today, folks, and look forward to our public hearings on our 2 items we talked about today.
yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.